Lady Cassandra Vance curtsied to every lady in the long gallery that night. In strict order of precedence, a small dry smile measured out to each in turn. And when the receiving line reached Verity Ashe, she inclined her head to the empty air a foot to the left of her and moved on, as though the space where a woman stood had simply been left unfurnished. Verity did not gasp. She had spent 6 years teaching her face to hold still through worse than a stranger's manners, and she held it now, chin level, hands folded at her waist, as if she had chosen to stand apart from the receiving line rather than been cut neatly out of it. She did not yet know that within the half hour a duke would cross that same gallery floor to claim the very space Cassandra had just refused to see. Had she known, she would have stood there just the same. The heat of the evening pressed against the tall windows like a hand that would not be shaken off, and the candles guttered low, and gold over powdered shoulders and borrowed jewels. And somewhere beneath the music, a clock in the hall was already counting toward Michaelmas, 11 days off, when the family's man of business would come to Thornfield to close the summer's accounts. Nobody in the gallery thought of the clock. They thought of the curtsy, and of the woman who had not received one, and of what it might mean that the Duke of Thornfield's own daughter had chosen, on the one night that mattered, to look through his houseguest as though she were glass. Verity Ashe was not, strictly, a guest. She was a hired hand in a borrowed gown, brought to Thornfield 7 weeks earlier to catalogue and repair the late Duchess's library, a task suited to a woman who had grown up at her father's bindery bench with a blade in one hand and a pot of paste in the other. She had not expected to be asked to the ball at all. She had certainly not expected the Duke himself to appear at her elbow, correct to the last button, and say, in a voice pitched only for her, "Miss Ashe, I believe this is our dance." He did not ask so much as confirm a thing already decided, the way a man reads aloud a sum he has already checked twice. The room, which had been murmuring about the curtsy, went perfectly silent instead, and in that silence Verity heard Lady Cassandra's fan close with a small, precise snap. "Your Grace," Verity said, "you are very sure of your own dances. I am sure of very little else," he said, "so I hoard my certainties where I find them." He held out his arm. She noted, because she noted such things, that his glove had been mended at the second finger, a fine, even, hand-sewn seam no valet would have troubled with, and that his eyes, when they found hers, did not once travel down to check the fit of her borrowed gown. Men who wished to purchase a woman looked at the gown first. He looked at her face, as though it were the only ledger in the room worth balancing. She took his arm. The room exhaled its gossip into every corner at once, and somewhere behind them a young matron was already whispering the sum of the Duke's fortune into her neighbor's ear, as if it were a hymn. They danced. He was not a graceful man, but he was an honest one, counting his steps under his breath the way a man counts coins he means to spend carefully, and when the figure turned them past the receiving line a second time, Verity felt, rather than saw, Lady Cassandra watching. She did not look. Her father had taught her, long before he taught her the smell of good vellum or the weight of a properly cut blade, that a curtsy is owed to truth before it is owed to rank, that a woman who bent her knee only to those who could reward her had not really bent it at all. She had curtsied on the way in to the housekeeper and the vicar's wife, and the coal merchant's daughter with precisely the depth she gave a baroness, and she had felt, doing it, that her father stood somewhere just behind her shoulder, satisfied. "You are thinking of something that is not this dance," the Duke said. "I am thinking that your daughter did not curtsy to me," Verity said, because she had already decided, 7 weeks into his household, that pretending not to notice things was a waste of a good memory. "I wondered whether I ought to mind." Something moved behind his eyes, quick and unhappy, gone before she could name it. "You ought to do exactly as you like," he said. "I find I have very little patience left for telling women what they ought to mind." It was, she would think later, the first true thing he had said to her, and also the first thing he left unfinished, for there was a whole sentence folded up behind it that he did not say. Not that night, not for many nights after. The dance ended. He bowed over her hand exactly as long as propriety allowed, and not 1/2 second longer, and Verity swept a fresh, obedient curtsy to the ballroom at large, and across the floor, Lady Cassandra Vance, still smiling, still perfectly correct, closed her hand around the clasp of a small garnet bracelet at her wrist and held it as though it were the only steady thing left in the room. She had worn her mother's bracelet every day for 3 years. She did not, most days, let herself think about why. By the time the last carriages rolled away down the drive that night, the story had already outrun the ball itself. The Duke of Thornfield had danced twice with his hired archivist, and not once with any lady his own rank had sent him, and his daughter, mistress of that house in all but name since her mother died, had cut the woman dead in front of 40 witnesses. Below stairs, in the housekeeper's room, an old woman named Mrs. Pruitt poured out 2 cups of tea nobody had asked for, and said to the empty chair across from her, "11 days to Michaelmas, and already the house is choosing sides." That never once in my life ended quietly. She was not wrong. She was, in fact, the only person under that roof who had already begun, in her own slow and unhurried way, to watch. The library at Thornfield smelled of beeswax and old paper, and Verity had come to think of that smell as the only honest thing in the house, since it never once pretended to be anything other than what it was. She was 3 days into re-sewing the spine of a ruined estate atlas when the Duke came in without knocking, which she had learned by then was simply his habit in his own library, and stood a careful 6 feet from her work table, as though he had measured the distance beforehand. "I did not come to admire your stitching," he said, "though it is very fine." "You came to negotiate," Verity said, not looking up. Men who stand exactly 6 feet away and open with a compliment are always about to negotiate. He almost smiled. She was beginning to catalog his almost smiles the way she cataloged watermarks, by rarity and by what triggered them. "Very well. I will not marry where there is doubt in the house, and there is doubt in the house, thanks to my daughter's manners last night. I would have the doubt settled honestly, between the 2 of us, before it is settled dishonestly by everyone else." "That sounds less like courtship than an audit," Verity said. "I have found," he said, "that the 2 are not so different as people pretend. Both require a man to state plainly what he means to give and what he expects in return, and both are ruined by sentiment pretending to be arithmetic." "And what do you mean to give?" "Whatever you will accept as freely offered. I do not ask for gratitude, I ask for honesty." "Then I will be honest," Verity said, setting down her needle at last. "I do not know you well enough to love you, Your Grace, and I distrust any woman who claims to have managed it in 7 weeks over a ledger and 2 dances. But I have not once, in 7 weeks, caught you in a lie, and in my experience, that alone makes a man worth the trouble of knowing better. That is the coldest proposal of continued acquaintance I have ever received." "You did not propose anything," Verity said. "You audited." This time he did smile, fully, and it changed his whole grave face so entirely that she understood, watching it, why the household spoke of him the way one speaks of weather that has finally broken after a long drought. It did not last. Nothing in that house lasted undisturbed for very long, and within the week Verity had learned why, from a source far blunter than the Duke himself. Mrs. Pruitt had run the household at Thornfield for 31 years, first under the old Duke and then under this one, and she had opinions about every soul who had ever slept beneath its roof, delivered without asking whether anyone wanted them. "You'll want to mind the quarter days in this house," she told Verity, arranging linens with the brisk contempt of a woman who had folded 10,000 of them and found fault with most. "Quarter days bring Mr. Sethwick, and Mr. Sethwick brings the books, and the books have not liked the daylight in this house for some years now, though nobody's fool enough to say so above stairs. You think something is wrong with the accounts." "I think," said Mrs. Pruitt, "that a girl who's kept her father's own house since she was 17, with no mother to check her, and a father too grieved to look at a column of figures without his hands shaking, learns very quickly that nobody above stairs counts anything twice. That is not an accusation, mind. That is simply how a house comes to be robbed, if it is ever going to be robbed at all, quietly, by someone already trusted with the keys." Verity thought of her own father then, as she often did when the talk turned to ledgers and trust, though she said nothing of it to Mrs. Pruitt that first week. Thomas Ashe had bound books for gentlemen's libraries the length of the county, a craftsman so exact that he could tell a forger's stitch from an honest one by touch alone, in the dark, with his eyes shut. He had raised her at the bench beside him after her mother died of a fever. Nobody had money enough to fight properly, and he had taught her that paper remembers what people are careful to forget, that ink dries the way a confession dries, permanently, whatever the hand above it later wishes to unsay. He had also, in the last year of his life, been dismissed without a character from a great house not unlike this one, accused of tampering with account pages he had in fact only bound, and he had died 2 winters later, still protesting his innocence to a world that had already stopped listening. Verity had taken the position at Thornfield because the wages were honest and the work was work she loved, not because she recognized the name on the letter of engagement. It was only in her 3rd week, running her thumb along the spine of an old estate ledger 40 years deep in the muniment room, that she had found her own father's mark tooled small into the leather, and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the season, that she had walked back into the very kind of house that had ruined him, without once being told so. Lady Cassandra found her alone in the small still room off the herb garden on the 4th morning after the ball, where Verity had gone to press flowers for the end papers of a book she was rebinding, and she came in so quietly, in slippers rather than boots, that Verity did not hear her until she spoke. "You have made yourself very comfortable here, Miss Ashe." Cassandra's voice was warm, almost affectionate, the particular gentleness of a woman who has learned that a soft voice frightens people more thoroughly than a raised one ever could. "I did not think a bindery girl would take so naturally to a duke's library. Paper is paper, my lady, whatever house it is kept in." "How practical of you to think so." Cassandra drifted along the shelf of drying herbs, touching nothing, and paused at the window where the light fell warm across her face. "My father is a grieving man, Miss Ashe, and grieving men mistake competence for tenderness. It is not the same thing. I would not like to see you mistake it either for your own sake. Is that a warning, my lady?" "It is a kindness," Cassandra said, and smiled the same small, dry smile she had given every lady in the receiving line but one. "I am famous for my kindnesses. Ask anyone in this house." She left as quietly as she had come, and Verity stood a long moment with a pressed violet crumbling faintly between her fingers, thinking that the sentence had been perfectly correct in every particular, and had still managed to feel exactly like a hand closing slowly around her wrist. She did not mention it to the Duke. She did, however, begin, without entirely deciding to, reading the household ledgers with the same trained eye she gave to disputed manuscripts, and on the following afternoon, Cross-referencing an old rent roll against the current quarter's entries, she noticed that a column of figures in April's hand did not sit quite level on the page, as though the ink had been laid down by someone copying rather than calculating. And she noticed, too, that the paper of that single leaf caught the light half a shade whiter than the pages on either side of it. She noted it in the back of her own working book, in her father's old shorthand, and thought no more of it that week, because 11 days had already become 7, and there was a great deal of honest work still to do before Michaelmas came looking for it. The thaw between the Duke and his archivist, once it began, did not announce itself with declarations, it announced itself with hours. He began coming to the library not to negotiate, but simply to sit, mending a broken hive frame at the far end of her worktable while she worked, sawdust and beeswax drifting into the same warm quiet as her paste and thread, and neither of them apologized for the silence, which suited them both. "You keep bees yourself," Verity said one such afternoon, watching his hands, rough and scarred at the knuckle in a way no duke's hands had any business being. "My steward thinks it beneath me. Is it?" "Grief keeps no calendar the hive will honor," he said, not looking up from the frame. "The bees do not pause for a man's mourning, and I found 3 years ago that I did not wish to be the only creature on this estate who had stopped moving. So I learned to keep them properly, with my own hands, because a man who only watches is not really keeping anything at all." "You collect bees," Verity said, "the way other men collect grievances. Doggedly, and to your own detriment. Your gloves are ruined. I have very few grievances left to collect. I find the bees suit me better." He set the frame down and looked at her fully then, in the plain, unhurried way she had come to recognize as the only kind of looking he did. "There is a thing I cannot yet lay before you, Miss Ashe, about this house. I would ask you to trust that I mean to, before Michaelmas, and not think worse of me for the waiting." "I do not think worse of a man for keeping his own counsel," she said. "I think worse of a man who pretends he has none to keep." He almost smiled again, the rare kind, and for one unguarded moment he laughed outright, a short, surprised sound, as though it had escaped him before he could weigh whether it was permitted, and Verity found she remembered the sound of it for the rest of that day, the way one remembers a single clear bell struck once in a quiet house. She did not yet know what the thing was that he could not lay before her. She would learn, before the 11 days were out, that his silence and her own withheld line in the working book shorthand were both circling, without either of them knowing it, the very same page. The blow, when it came dressed as an accident. Verity had left her working book open on the library table overnight, a habit she would afterward curse herself for, and when she returned the next morning to continue her cross-referencing, she found Mr. Sethwick already in the room, the family's man of business summoned 4 days early by a note the Duke swore he had not sent, standing over the open rent roll with his spectacles pushed up into his hair and an expression she had not seen on a solicitor's face before, somewhere between apology and accusation. "Miss Ashe," he said, "I wonder if you would explain your notations in the margin of the April accounts." She looked. In her own hand, in her father's old shorthand that no one in that house should have been able to read, sat a note she recognized as hers, and beneath it, in a hand very close to her own, but not quite. 3 lines she had never written, recording a sum removed from the quarter's rents and initialed, unmistakably, V.A. "I did not write that," Verity said, and heard, even as she said it, how every falsely accused person in the history of the world must have sounded saying exactly those 4 words. "The hand is remarkably like yours," Sethwick said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "It is very like my father's hand," Verity said, "which was the point of teaching it to me, so that I might finish work he could not." She heard her own voice rising and brought it down by force, chin level, hands folded, the old defense her face had learned years before this house existed. "Someone has used my notation against me, Mr. Sethwick, and used it cleverly, because they knew precisely what it would look like to a stranger's eye." "That is certainly one explanation," Sethwick said, in the careful tone of a man determined to remain neutral until the facts compelled him otherwise, and it was in that same careful tone, an hour later, that he informed the Duke of what had been found, while Verity stood in the doorway and heard, through the half-open panel, 3 words that struck her harder than the false entry itself: "Someone close to me." She did not hear the rest of the sentence. She did not wait to hear it. She had spent her whole short, cruel education in that house learning to read a face for what it would not say, and she had just, for the first time since she arrived at Thornfield, utterly misread one. She did not speak to him that day, and he, occupied with Sethwick and with a private conversation with his daughter that lasted the better part of an hour behind a closed door, did not seek her out, and the silence between them curdled into something neither of them had chosen. It was Lady Cassandra who came to her that evening in the small parlor off the east stair, with a folded paper and a face arranged into an expression of genuine, exquisite sorrow. "I have spoken to my father," Cassandra said. "He does not wish to see you disgraced publicly, Miss Ashe, whatever the books may show. There is a sum here." She set the folded paper on the table between them, and Verity did not need to open it to know its weight by the fold alone, and a letter of character, unsigned but true in every particular, that will see you comfortably placed in any household in the county that does not ask too many questions. All you need do is go quietly before Michaelmas and let the matter rest. And if I do not go quietly, then Mr. Sethwick will be obliged to lay the matter before a magistrate, and my father, whatever his feelings, cannot be seen to shield a woman accused of robbing his own tenants. You must see that." Verity looked at the folded paper for a long moment, and then at Cassandra's face, composed and sorrowful, and, beneath the sorrow, watching her with the fixed attention of a woman waiting to see whether a trap has closed. "You once told me you were famous for your kindnesses," Verity said. "I begin to understand what they cost the people who receive them." "That is not an answer." "No," Verity said, and pushed the folded paper back across the table, untouched. "It is a refusal. I did not take that money from those tenants, my lady, and I will not take this money from you either, whatever it costs me to refuse it. I would rather leave this house with an empty purse and a true name than a full one and a false confession sewn into it, because I was taught, very young, exactly what the second kind of leaving does to a person for the rest of her life." Cassandra's face did not change, quite, but her hand rose, unconsciously, to the clasp of the garnet bracelet at her wrist, and held it. "Then I am sorry for you, Miss Ashe," she said, and for one unguarded instant something that might almost have been genuine regret moved behind her eyes before the smooth mask came down again. "Truly, I am." The darkest of it came 2 days later, when Verity was asked, with what courtesy the situation allowed, to remove herself from Thornfield until the matter of the accounts could be properly settled, and she went, that gray morning, with one trunk and her father's old working satchel, and no more than a handful of words exchanged with the Duke, who stood at the top of the drive with a face like a house shuttered against a storm, and said only, "I do not believe it of you," which was not the same, she thought bitterly, climbing into the hired gig, as saying so where anyone could hear. She took a small room above the chandler's shop in the village, with Mrs. Pruitt's married niece for a landlady, and there, on the second wretched evening. With Michaelmas now only 2 days off and no way left to prove anything at all, a boy came up the stairs with a parcel wrapped in oilcloth and no note attached beyond a single line in a hand she knew at once, blunt as a hammer and twice as welcome. I have never in 31 years thrown away a single old ledger, whatever anyone above stairs believed. Look at the stitching. Inside the oilcloth lay a account book 40 years old, its leather worn soft and tooled small into the spine, exactly where she had found it once before in the muniment room, her own father's mark. She opened it with hands that would not quite stay steady and understood, turning the pages by candlelight, precisely what she was holding, and precisely what it would take to make anyone else believe it, before the last light of Michaelmas went down over Thornfield's roof. She was back at the gates of Thornfield before the sun was fully up, the old ledger wrapped against the damp in her father's satchel, and it was Mr. Sethwick himself she asked to see first, not the Duke, because she had learned enough in her short bitter education to know that proof offered to a neutral instrument carries weight a lover's belief cannot supply. "I do not ask you to trust my word, sir," she said, standing in his temporary room off the estate office with the old ledger open on the desk between them. "I ask you to trust your own eyes. My father bound this book 40 years ago, and every signature in it is sewn with his own particular lock-stitch, 9th leaf to 9th leaf, a habit no other binder in this county shares, because he invented it himself and taught it to no apprentice but me. Compare it to the April rent roll you found in my library book, and tell me honestly whether the false page was stitched by the same hand that bound the volume around it, or whether it was cut in afterward by someone in a hurry." Sethwick, to his credit, did not simply take her word. He sent for the current household ledger himself, and the two of them bent over both books by the gray morning window for the better part of an hour, comparing thread and grain and the particular iron-gall darkness of old ink against the thinner, bluer ink of a page not 18 months laid down. And when at last he straightened, his face had lost its careful neutrality entirely. "This will need to be shown before witnesses, Miss Ashe, not simply told to me in a private room. I will not have it said afterward that I settled the matter quietly to spare a great house its embarrassment." "That," Verity said, "is precisely what I came to ask you for." He sent word within the hour. The Michaelmas audit, already fixed for the following morning, would proceed as planned in the long gallery rather than the estate office, before the household and such neighbors as the Duke chose to invite, and the household ledgers, old and new alike, would be examined in the light where anyone might look. Word of it reached Lady Cassandra by noon, and it was Mrs. Pruitt, crossing the servants' hall an hour later, who reported to Verity with grim satisfaction that her ladyship had gone very white about the mouth on hearing it, and had not touched her dinner, and had been seen, twice, standing quite still at her mother's portrait in the long gallery, with her hand pressed flat against the frame, as though she meant to hold the whole wall up by main force. Michaelmas morning came in cool and clear, the first true break in the summer's heat, and the long gallery filled with more witnesses than any quarter-day audit at Thornfield had ever drawn. For word of a duke's daughter and a duke's archivist and a disputed sum of money travels faster through a county than any invitation ever could. Mr. Sethwick presided at a table set beneath the tall windows, the old ledger and the new laid side by side upon it, and the Duke stood not behind the table but beside Verity, which the room noted and did not fail to discuss under its breath. "We are here," Sethwick said, "to examine an irregularity in the estate accounts and an accusation laid against Miss Verity Ashe. I will ask that the matter be conducted in order and that no one interrupt a witness before they have finished." He held the disputed page to the window glass, where the morning light came through it plainly, and the room went very quiet. "You will observe," he said, "that this leaf, though bound into a book 2 years old, carries a watermark 18 months younger than every page beside it, and that its stitching does not match the lock stitch common to the rest of the volume, a stitch I am reliably informed originates with the binder Thomas Ashe, whose mark appears in the estate's own ledgers going back 40 years, and whose daughter stands before you now." He set the page down. Someone cut this leaf in afterward, in a hand made to resemble Miss Ashe's own shorthand, well enough to deceive a stranger, though not, as it happens, well enough to deceive paper. Into the silence that followed, the Duke asked the one question the whole gallery had been waiting, without quite admitting it, to hear. Who had access to the estate ledgers, and to Miss Ashe's working book, besides Miss Ashe herself? It was the underclerk, Dibbs, standing near the door with his hat crushed in both hands, who broke first, before anyone had even turned to look at him, because a man who has been waiting 3 days for the question finds the waiting worse than the answer. "I only copied what I was given, Your Grace. I swear it. I never knew what it was for until it was done, and I was paid to say nothing after." He stopped himself a heartbeat too late. "Paid by whom, Dibbs?" Sethwick asked, quietly, and the whole gallery leaned in as one body to hear the answer, and Dibbs, white to the lips, turned his crushed hat once in his hands and said the name everyone in the room had already, in their private hearts, begun to suspect. Lady Cassandra did not wait to be named a second time. She stepped forward from beside her mother's portrait, quite steady, quite composed, and said, in the same gentle voice she had used to curtsy to 40 ladies and withhold it from one, "He is telling the truth. I asked him to make the copy, and I gave him money afterward to keep silent about it, and I would ask that whatever is said next be said to me, and not to him. Because he acted only on my instruction, and out of a debt I put him under, not out of any wickedness of his own." From the small writing case Verity had once catalogued among the late Duchess's things, the very case, in fact, that had first shown her the discrepancy in a torn accompanying letter, Sethwick now drew a second bundle, letters Mrs. Pruitt had found in her one decisive and entirely unauthorized act of that whole difficult month, hidden beneath a false lining Cassandra had sewn into her own jewel case, and had them read aloud without further preamble, letters from a Mr. Rafferty Quinn, once a suitor Cassandra had loved at 19 and been publicly jilted by at 20, who had kept certain foolish letters of hers from that season, and had spent 2 years since bleeding her quietly for the price of their silence, sums that had grown, by this last spring, larger than her own small allowance could answer. So that she had turned, in desperation and in a shame she could not bear to lay before her grieving father, to the household accounts themselves, and, when Verity's trained eye threatened to find what she had done, to Verity's own ruin as the surest way to protect her own. The gallery, hearing Quinn's letters read plain in Sethwick's flat clerk's voice, made a single low sound of collective understanding, the sound a crowd makes when cruelty is finally explained rather than excused. Cassandra did not weep until the last letter was finished, and then she wept only briefly, one hand pressed to her mouth, standing very straight beside her mother's painted image as though the two of them were, for once, facing the room together. "I did not mean for it to reach Miss Ashe," she said. "I told myself, every single time, that I would find another way before it truly harmed anyone, and every time there was no other way, because I had already spent what there was to spend." The Duke crossed the gallery floor to his daughter, and the room, expecting fury, watched instead as he simply stood before her a long moment, his hand rising to touch, briefly, the same garnet bracelet she had worn every day for 3 years, her mother's bracelet, and said, low enough that only those nearest heard it, Your mother would have wanted you protected from him long before this. I should have seen it. I let my own grief stand in the doorway of yours, and you paid for both." Then, louder, to the gallery entire, he said what mercy in that house had always looked like, plain and unadorned. There would be no magistrate, no public ruin beyond what the gallery had already witnessed, and would, out of respect for a name 300 years old, agree to let rest there. Lady Cassandra would remove to her great-aunt's house near Bath before the month was out, with a settled allowance sufficient for a quiet life, and insufficient for any further debt. Dibbs would leave Thornfield's service without prosecution and with 3 months' wages, on the understanding he never set foot in the county's great houses again, and Mr. Rafferty Quinn's name would be quietly laid before every solicitor and lender in 3 counties, so that whatever ruin came to him would come by his own conduct and not by anyone's revenge. "I do this," the Duke said, "not for the man who wronged my daughter, and not for my daughter's comfort alone, but because a house that answers cruelty with cruelty teaches its children nothing but the shape of the next cruelty. I would rather Thornfield be remembered for mercy than for its accounts, though I mean to keep both in better order from this day forward." Verity, watching Cassandra be led from the gallery by a housekeeper who had, an hour before, provided the very evidence that undid her, and who now walked beside her with an arm laid quietly across her shoulders, thought of her own father, dismissed without a character from a house very like this one, and understood, with a fullness that felt almost like grief itself, that the mercy this house withheld from him 40 years ago, it had finally, imperfectly, learned to give. It was 3 days later, in the same library that smelled of beeswax and old paper, that the Duke of Thornfield asked Verity Ashe to marry him, and he did it so plainly, so entirely without ceremony, that she nearly missed the moment for what it was. "The matter of the accounts is settled," he said. "The matter of my daughter is as settled as grief and mercy together can make it. There is no longer any stake left in this house that a marriage to you would serve, no scandal it would silence, no doubt it would answer. I find I would like to ask you anyway." "That is not a proposal," Verity said. "That is an audit." "I have given up the grievances," he said, and there was the rare full smile again, the one she had catalogued so carefully. "I kept the bees. I find I would like to keep you too," doggedly, "and to my own benefit for once rather than my own penance. Marry me because you wish it, Miss Ashe. It is the only reason I will take." She thought of 100 clever answers and gave him none of them. She said instead, quietly, the truest thing she knew. "You once told me you do not ask for gratitude, only honesty. I find I love you, Your Grace, quite plainly and quite honestly, and I would have told you so a fortnight ago if a duke's daughter had not stood between us with a folded paper and a false page." "She will not stand there again," he said, and took her hand, and did not let it go. The wedding, when it came in the last mild week of October, was small enough that Mrs. Pruitt wept openly through the whole of it and pretended afterward that a draught from the vestry door had caused it, and the vicar's wife curtsied to that very first night with precisely the depth given a duchess, stood as witness beside Mr. Sethwick and Lady Honoria Vale, who had once received the new Duchess of Thornfield with the coolest civility county manners allowed, and who had, over the long weeks of Michaelmas, revised her opinion entirely, and had lately, it was whispered, begun revising her opinion of Mr. Sethwick as well. The old ledger, Thomas Ashe's own binding, was placed in the muniment room with a small brass plate set beneath it, at the Duke's own order, naming the binder honestly for the first time in 40 years, and restoring, in ink and brass, if in nothing else that could be given back to a dead man, a name a great house had once been careless enough to ruin. A year turned, nearly to the week, and Thornfield held its summer ball again, the windows thrown open against the same pressing heat, the same candles gold over the same worn floor, and this time it was the Duchess of Thornfield who stood at the head of the receiving line, curtsying to every lady who came through the door, in strict order, with a warmth that owed nothing at all to rank. When Lady Cassandra Vance arrived from Bath, invited by her father's own hand and her stepmother's plainly written postscript beneath his, the whole gallery seemed to hold its breath at once, remembering, and Cassandra herself paused at the threshold, as though the memory of a year ago stood physically in the doorway before her. Verity crossed the floor to meet her before she could decide whether to come further, and sank into a curtsy as full and unhurried as any she had ever given, and said, loud enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear and carry off with them into the night, "I was told once that some women are merely tolerated in a house like this one. I have decided that no one under this roof will be, ever again." Cassandra's eyes filled, and she returned the curtsy, deep and entirely without performance, the first honest one the gallery had seen her give in longer than anyone there could remember, and somewhere above them a robin that had nested in the library eave every spring since Verity first came to Thornfield, sang its ordinary evening song into the ordinary golden light, indifferent to all of it. The way birds always are to the things that break and mend a house. A curtsy is owed to truth before it is owed to rank, Verity thought, watching her husband cross the same gallery floor toward her a second time, a year older, unhurried, entirely certain, and this time, everyone in the room understood exactly what truth was being told. If this story warmed you, if you found yourself holding your breath for a woman who simply would not take a bribe to save herself, then stay a while longer by this fire with me. Pull your chair a little closer, let the kettle sit warm on the hob, and tell me which moment stayed with you longest, the curtsy withheld, or the one finally given. Keep your place here by the hearth if you'd like more evenings like this one. It costs you only a moment to stay close, and I keep the chair warm regardless. Until then, be steady-handed with the ones who are still proving themselves to you, and gentle with the ones, like Cassandra, who never learned how to ask for help honestly. Sleep well, and mind your own ledgers kindly.